I spent 6 months of my life creating the biggest project of my 22-year career. I skipped weekends, missed family dinners, and poured every ounce of myself into making it perfect. I thought it would be my legacy at the company, until the day my boss handed it to his nephew and smiled like it was his idea all along. Before we continue, please make sure to subscribe. It helps us bring you more true stories like this, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I read them all and love hearing from you. I had just turned 50, and after more than 2 decades at the same company, I knew its every strength and weakness like the back of my hand. I'd weathered layoffs, mergers, and leadership changes, always adapting, always delivering. So when our CEO announced we needed a bold new initiative to win over our biggest potential client in years, I knew this was my chance to leave my mark. I threw myself into it, crafting the proposal, designing the rollout plan, even anticipating potential snags months in advance. My boss, Richard, seemed impressed, maybe too impressed. He started stopping by my desk more often, asking for detailed updates, wanting to see every iteration of my work. At first, I took it as a compliment. After all, Richard had always been more hands-off, so his sudden interest made me think the project was as important to him as it was to me. What I didn't realize then was that he wasn't gathering information to help me. He was gathering ammunition to take credit. Richard's nephew, Kyle, had joined the company less than a year ago. Fresh out of college, with no experience beyond an internship, he'd been given a cushy role in strategy development, a title that sounded important but carried no real responsibility. Everyone knew he was there because of family ties, and most of us assumed he'd coast quietly in the background. I certainly never imagined he'd have anything to do with my project. But the closer we got to the deadline, the more Richard's requests felt odd. He wanted every file sent to him directly. He insisted on private review meetings instead of our usual team check-ins. He told me not to loop in other managers just yet, saying it would be a nice surprise for the higher-ups if we kept it under wraps until the final presentation. I didn't question it. After all, Richard had been my boss for years, and trust was second nature at that point. By the time I had the final proposal ready, I felt exhausted but proud. It was airtight, innovative, and had the potential to land us the client that could double our revenue. I imagined my name attached to it, the recognition it would bring, maybe even a long overdue promotion. I had no idea that my boss had been setting the stage for a betrayal that would not only rob me of credit but humiliate me in front of the entire company. The morning of the big presentation, I walked into the conference room with my laptop and a knot of nervous excitement in my stomach. This was it, the culmination of half a year's work, the moment I'd been building toward. The client's executive team was already seated, their eyes scanning the room, and I caught Richard at the head of the table, grinning like a man about to unveil something extraordinary. I set up my laptop, ready to lead the pitch, when he casually waved me toward a seat in the back. "Just relax and watch. You've done enough," he said with a wink. At first I thought he meant it as a joke, but then Kyle, his nephew, stepped forward and connected his own laptop to the projector. I froze. The title slide that appeared on the screen was my project. My words, my graphics, my research, but under the heading, presented by Kyle Thompson. My name was nowhere in sight. The next 30 minutes felt like an out-of-body experience. I sat in stunned silence as Kyle stumbled through my carefully crafted talking points, mangling the flow, skipping over crucial details, and improvising half-baked answers to the client's questions. Richard sat beside him, nodding encouragingly, chiming in only to steer the conversation away from the parts Kyle clearly didn't understand. The client looked politely engaged, but I could see the confusion in their eyes. This was clearly not the work of the person speaking. When Kyle finished, Richard stood and launched into a closing statement that made my stomach turn. I'm so proud of my nephew for developing such an innovative proposal in such a short time. It shows the kind of young talent we're cultivating here. I wanted to scream, to stand up and say, "No, this is mine, every word of it." But I didn't. Years in the corporate world had taught me that calling out a boss publicly could end a career faster than any performance review. So I sat there, my hands gripping the edge of my chair so tightly my knuckles ached, forcing a neutral expression as applause filled the room. Inside, I was burning. When the meeting ended, Richard clapped me on the shoulder as if nothing had happened. "Great work behind the scenes," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You really made Kyle shine today." That was when it hit me. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This had been his plan all along. The extra check-ins, the requests for private updates, the insistence on keeping the project under wraps. All of it had been about stripping my name from my work and handing it to his nephew on a silver platter. I left the room numb, my ears ringing with a mix of humiliation and rage. But beneath that was something else, a cold, sharp clarity. Richard thought he'd gotten away with it. He thought I'd swallow the insult, chalk it up to office politics, and keep working quietly in the background. He had no idea that in that moment I made a decision. If he wanted to play dirty, I was going to make sure the game ended in my favor. The rest of that day passed in a haze, but the moment I got home, I pulled my laptop out and started digging. If Richard thought I was going to let this slide, he didn't know me at all. For 22 years, I'd been the one quietly keeping the gears of this company turning, documenting everything, organizing files with the kind of precision that made auditors smile. I knew where every draft lived, every timestamp was stored, and every email chain was archived. And now, all that meticulousness was going to work against him. I started with the project files on my work computer. Every single slide, every spreadsheet, every diagram had my fingerprints all over them. Metadata with my name as the creator. Edit histories showing weeks and months of work. Version logs proving I had built this from the ground up. Even the final version Kyle had used in the presentation was just a copy of my master file, with the title slide swapped out to feature his name. Next, I moved to emails. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, of messages between Richard and me discussing the project, outlining the strategy, refining the pitch. There were even moments where he specifically complimented my work, saying, "You've outdone yourself. This could land us the client of the decade." I forwarded everything to my personal account, carefully labeling and organizing them so nothing would get lost. Then I dug into the meeting calendar. Every private review he'd scheduled with me had notes I'd typed up afterward, summarizing changes and next steps. And every one of those notes had my initials at the top. As I worked, I felt the humiliation from that morning cooling into something sharper, more deliberate. This wasn't just about proving the truth. It was about building a case so airtight that Richard and his precious nephew couldn't wiggle free even if they tried. I started keeping a small notebook in my purse, jotting down dates, times, and details of every conversation, every odd request, every comment from coworkers who'd noticed the sudden shift in credit. A few colleagues had quietly approached me after the meeting, saying they'd been surprised to see Kyle presenting. I didn't push them to speak out, not yet, but I noted their names and what they'd said. Witnesses, if I needed them later. By the end of the week, I had a digital folder that was a treasure trove of evidence. Documents, emails, screenshots, calendar entries, even photos of my handwritten notes from early brainstorming sessions. It was enough to tell the whole story without me saying a word. But I wasn't going to make my move just yet. Richard thought he had won, and I wanted him to keep thinking that. The more confident he was, the less careful he'd be, and the more rope he'd give me to hang him with. I knew one thing for certain. When I finally decided to act, I wasn't going to HR. I was going to someone who could make this hurt in ways Richard hadn't even imagined. That weekend, I met my old friend Melissa for coffee. She and I had worked together years ago before she left the corporate grind to become an attorney specializing in employment law. We hadn't seen each other in months, but the moment she saw my face, she knew something was wrong. I didn't waste time with small talk. I laid out everything. The months I'd spent building the project, the way Richard had slowly siphoned off my work, the humiliating meeting where Kyle presented it as his own, and the mountain of proof I'd gathered since. Melissa listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief to something I recognized as the early stages of a legal strategy. When I finally finished, she took a slow sip of her coffee and said, "You realize you have an airtight case, right?" My heart kicked up a notch. "For what, exactly?" I asked. She leaned in and began listing them off. Misappropriation of intellectual property, retaliation, constructive dismissal if they tried to push me out, and even reputational damage since my professional credibility had been undermined in front of a major client. Each term hit like a spark, lighting a fire I hadn't felt in days. Not just anger, but purpose. Melissa explained that with the evidence I'd collected, we could make a formal legal demand that would force the company into a settlement or face a public lawsuit. Most companies will settle fast to avoid the PR nightmare, she said, especially if you have clients or witnesses who can back up your story. I thought of the colleagues who'd quietly told me they were shocked to see Kyle presenting. I thought of the client executives who had looked confused during his fumbling answers. The pieces were all there. All I had to do was fit them together. She advised me to keep working as if nothing was wrong, to avoid tipping Richard off before the legal notice was ready. "Play the long game," she said with a small, knowing smile. "The more confident he is, the harder he'll fall." When I left the cafe, I felt like I was walking with a secret weapon tucked under my arm. My humiliation had been replaced with something far more dangerous: a plan. Over the next 2 weeks, I went into work every day and did exactly what Melissa advised. I smiled, I nodded, I even congratulated Kyle when Richard paraded him around as the rising star of the company. Inside, I was cataloging every slip-up, every careless brag, every email where Richard accidentally confirmed details of my project to other managers. It was like watching someone dig their own grave and knowing I was the one who'd hand them the shovel. By the time Melissa sent me the first draft of the legal demand letter, I knew there was no turning back. This wasn't just about getting credit anymore. It was about making sure Richard never pulled this stunt on anyone else again. He thought he'd stolen my legacy and handed it to his nephew. What he didn't know was that I was about to take something from him he valued far more: his career. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. The project that I had nurtured for 6 months was not something you could just wing with a few bullet points and some fake confidence. It was a complex strategy with moving parts, client-specific requirements, and a very precise rollout schedule. Within a week of Kyle taking over, deadlines were missed. Vendors started emailing about unanswered questions. Key deliverables were incomplete or riddled with mistakes. I sat quietly at my desk, still playing my part, and watched as the chaos grew. One of our top clients called in to say they were confused by the changes in the plan and wanted clarification on why certain agreed-upon elements were missing. I knew exactly why. Kyle didn't understand them. He had skimmed the surface of my work but never grasped the foundation beneath it. The real turning point came during a follow-up meeting with the same executives who had sat through his original presentation. I wasn't invited, of course. Richard had made sure of that. But word travels fast in an office. A colleague who attended told me it was a disaster. Kyle couldn't answer half the questions thrown at him. When pressed, he promised to circle back with the team, which was his way of buying time so he could run to Richard for help. The client's confidence in us wavered, and the next morning, Richard looked more stressed than I'd ever seen him. He barked orders, shuffled priorities, and started calling me into his office under the pretense of checking in on other work, but I could see the subtext in his eyes. He wanted me to quietly fix the mess without drawing attention to the fact that his golden boy was floundering. I made sure to tread carefully. I answered his questions, but only in ways that highlighted how much of the original plan had been altered or ignored. "Oh, that's from the section we cut when Kyle revised the proposal," I'd say innocently, or "that detail was in my initial draft, but it must not have made it into his version." Each comment was a seed, and I planted them everywhere. In casual hallway conversations, in emails to colleagues, even in chats with the client's project liaison. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. People started realizing that what was falling apart wasn't my work. It was Kyle's mishandling of it. By the end of the month, the damage was too big to hide. A major milestone was missed entirely, causing the client to threaten pulling out of the deal. I heard Richard on the phone, his voice tight and defensive, trying to salvage what he could. Meanwhile, I kept my smile polite and my head down, knowing that every mistake Kyle made was another nail in Richard's coffin. They had taken my work and my credit, but they couldn't take my competence. And that was about to become my greatest weapon. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray, rainy day that already put everyone in a bad mood. Richard called me into his office, closing the door behind me like he was about to share some great secret. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands over his stomach, and delivered the kind of line that makes your blood run cold. "The client's upset, and frankly, I think part of the problem is that you haven't been supportive enough of Kyle." I just stared at him, trying to process the audacity of the words coming out of his mouth. He went on, painting a picture in which my supposed lack of cooperation had contributed to the project's collapse, as if I were some petty employee sulking over not getting credit. "You're experienced enough to know that the team succeeds or fails together," he said, his tone heavy with condescension. In his mind, he wasn't the one who had stolen my work. He was the hero trying to guide me toward professionalism in the face of my own bruised ego. It was almost impressive, the way he could twist the truth into a narrative that suited him. But sitting there, listening to his carefully rehearsed nonsense, something inside me clicked. The humiliation I'd felt in that first meeting, the simmering anger that had been building ever since, it all condensed into a single, razor-sharp thought. Enough. I had played the long game exactly as Melissa had advised, gathering evidence, letting him dig his own grave, but now he was trying to push me into the hole with him. That wasn't going to happen. I let him finish his little speech, nodding at all the right moments, my face a mask of polite agreement. Then I stood, thanked him for the feedback, and walked out without another word. Back at my desk, I opened my email and drafted a simple resignation letter. No drama, no accusations, just a clean break. I sent it to HR, copied Richard, and began packing my things. He appeared in my doorway minutes later, feigning concern, asking if we could talk this through. I told him there was nothing left to say. As I zipped up my bag, I felt the weight of the past few months lifting from my shoulders. For the first time since this began, I wasn't operating from a place of damage control. I was in control. Before I walked out the door, I pulled out my faux 54i and sent Melissa a single text. "It's time." Within an hour, she had the lawsuit paperwork finalized and ready to serve. By the end of the week, Richard would be receiving a legal notice that would make his stomach drop. All his smug confidence, all his calculated theft of my work was about to come crashing down. And the best part was I had given him every chance to think he'd gotten away with it. Now, the real reckoning was about to begin. The legal notice went out on a Thursday morning, and by noon my phone was buzzing with messages from former co-workers who had clearly heard the news. Melissa had filed a formal claim for intellectual property theft, misappropriation of credit, and reputational damage, backed by a meticulously organized evidence package that would make any jury's head spin. Every draft, every email, every meeting note, every timestamp, all neatly laid out to show exactly how my work had been stolen and rebranded under Kyle's name. Richard didn't just have to contend with me, he now had to contend with the fact that this case was so airtight it could ruin him in open court. From what Melissa told me, the company's legal team had reacted exactly as expected: immediate panic. They knew the client had already lost faith in the project, and now they were facing the possibility of having their internal politics and nepotism dragged into the public eye. In our industry, reputation was currency, and the thought of losing millions in contracts because of one arrogant executive's stunt had management scrambling. By the following day, the first cracks in their armor began to show. Richard, who had always strutted through the halls like he's owned the place, was suddenly keeping his office door shut and speaking in hushed tones. Kyle, usually smug and chatty, looked like he'd swallowed a lemon every time someone mentioned my name. I heard from a friend still inside that an emergency board meeting had been called, and Richard had been asked to provide his version of events. Unfortunately for him, his version didn't align with the mountain of documented proof sitting in my lawyer's hands. He tried to claim that Kyle had collaborated on the project from the beginning, but when pressed for details, he couldn't produce a single piece of evidence to back it up. Melissa kept me updated at every step. The company had two options: fight a losing battle in court or settle quickly and quietly. Both came with a price, but one would save them from public humiliation. I wasn't bluffing. If they chose to fight, I was ready to go the distance. My confidence only grew when Melissa told me that two of my former colleagues had already agreed to testify that the project was entirely my work. And then there was the client's project liaison, who had apparently mentioned to the board that they had been surprised by my absence from the presentation and concerned about Kyle's lack of understanding. That was the nail in the coffin. I spent those days in an odd state of calm. For months, I had been walking on eggshells, pretending not to see what was happening. Now I didn't have to pretend anymore. The truth was out, and the people who had tried to bury it were scrambling to keep their own careers intact. Every time I thought about Richard reading that legal notice, I felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. He had underestimated me from the start, and now that arrogance was costing him everything. It took less than a week for the company to decide which limb to cut off to save the body. I got the news from Melissa first. Richard had been asked to resign effective immediately. The internal email announcing his departure was the kind of bland corporate nonsense you could practically smell through the screen. We thank Richard for his years of service and wish him the best in his future endeavors. But the truth was obvious to anyone paying attention. The board needed a scapegoat, and Richard's fingerprints were all over the mess. Kyle's fate wasn't much better. Without Richard to shield him, his lack of skill was glaring, and the project's collapse was impossible to ignore. He was quietly reassigned to an entry-level role in a different department. A move so humiliating that it was clearly designed to push him out without an official firing. Word from my friends still inside was that he lasted only 3 more weeks before quitting altogether. Meanwhile, the company's legal team reached out to Melissa, suddenly eager to talk settlement. They didn't want to go to trial, not with the amount of evidence we had and the witnesses ready to speak on my behalf. The figure they offered was substantial. Not just a payout for the stolen work, but enough to acknowledge the damage they'd done to my professional reputation. Melissa, ever the shark, negotiated it higher, adding a confidentiality clause that, ironically, they were far more interested in than I was. They wanted to bury this story so deep it would never see daylight. I signed the agreement because it served my purpose, and because I didn't need to drag their name through the mud publicly. The people who mattered already knew the truth. The sweetest part wasn't the money, though it was enough to give me the freedom to choose my next move on my terms. It was the knowledge that Richard had fallen on the sword he'd sharpened himself. He'd stolen from me, humiliated me, and tried to frame me when things went wrong. In the end, all his scheming had cost him his job, his reputation, and whatever fragile pride he had left. As for Kyle, the boy wonder who had coasted on family connections, his sudden fall from grace had been just as satisfying to watch. Without Richard propping him up, he was just another inexperienced 20-something with nothing to show for his time in the company. When Melissa called to confirm the settlement had been finalized and the funds transferred, I felt something I hadn't in months: peace. It wasn't just about winning the case. It was about walking away knowing I had taken back control. Richard had gambled on my silence. He had assumed I would swallow the insult and fade quietly into the background. But instead, I had dismantled his plan piece by piece until there was nothing left for him to hide behind. And the best part? He never saw it coming. The morning after the settlement cleared, I woke up without the familiar weight pressing down on my chest. For the first time in months, I wasn't bracing myself for another underhanded move from Richard or another smug smile from Kyle. Instead, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop to a blank document titled simply, "Next Steps." The payout had been generous enough to cover my expenses for a long time, but I had no intention of treating it as a cushion to coast on. 22 years in the corporate world had taught me more than just how to manage projects. It had taught me how to navigate clients, lead teams, and build trust, even in high-pressure situations. And I realized, sitting there with my coffee steaming beside me, that I didn't need to hand those skills over to another company that could treat me like I was disposable. I could build something of my own. Within 2 weeks, I had registered my own consultancy, a lean operation that specialized in strategic project development. The very thing I'd been doing for decades, only now, the credit would always have my name on it. I reached out to a few former clients I had worked with over the years, not to poach them outright, but to let them know I was available if they needed independent support. To my surprise and quiet delight, the response was overwhelming. Several of them told me they had been disappointed with how my old company handled things after I stepped away, and they jumped at the chance to work directly with me. The first contract I signed wasn't just profitable. It was from a client Richard had desperately tried to land during my time at the company and failed. As the weeks turned into months, my calendar filled. I hired a small but talented team, many of them people I had mentored in my previous job, and we built a work culture based on respect and recognition. The kind of place I had wished my old company could be. Every project we completed, every client we impressed, felt like another layer of healing over the wound Richard had left. My confidence, which had taken such a beating during those months of betrayal, came back stronger than ever. And though I didn't talk about the lawsuit publicly, the settlement terms made sure of that. Word somehow got around in the industry. People knew. They knew whose work that infamous project had really been, and they knew the woman behind it had landed on her feet in spectacular fashion. Sometimes I would think back to that conference room, to the moment I realized what Richard had done, and I would smile. If he had just let me present my own work, if he had just given me the credit I had earned, I probably would have stayed at that company until I retired. But his greed had pushed me out. And in doing so, he had pushed me into the best move of my career. About a year after I walked out of that office for the last time, I was invited to speak at a major industry conference. It was the kind of event I used to dream about attending as a presenter. Hundreds of executives, project managers, and innovators from across the country, all gathered to share their biggest successes and lessons learned. The organizers had heard about my consultancy's recent string of high-profile wins and wanted me to give a keynote on turning adversity into opportunity. I accepted without hesitation. Standing backstage that morning, I could feel the same nervous energy I'd had before my old project's presentation. Only this time, there was no Richard hovering, no Kyle fumbling through my words. Every slide, every talking point, every example was mine, and my name was right there on the big screen for everyone to see. When I walked on stage, The applause was warm, but it was nothing compared to the silence that fell when I began telling my story. I didn't name names. The confidentiality agreement was still in place, but I painted the picture in broad strokes. The months of work, the sudden shift in credit, the moment I realized my project had been presented under someone else's name, and the long, deliberate process of reclaiming what was mine. I watched as heads nodded around the room, as people exchanged knowing glances. This wasn't just my story. It was a story they had all either lived or feared living. By the time I described launching my own business and signing my first major client, the energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't just sympathy anymore, it was respect. When I finished, the applause was thunderous. People came up to me afterward, shaking my hand, thanking me for speaking so openly. A few even confided that they had their own Richards back at the office and were now thinking about their next steps. And then, in the middle of the crowd, I spotted a familiar face, one of my former colleagues from the old company. She gave me a knowing smile and said, "You know Richard heard about this, right? Word travels fast." I couldn't help but laugh. The thought of him sitting somewhere, hearing through the grapevine that I was standing on a stage in front of hundreds of industry leaders being celebrated for the kind of work he had tried to steal, was sweeter than any courtroom verdict. As I left the conference hall, I realized something important. Revenge wasn't about destroying someone else. It was about building something so strong, so undeniably yours, that their attempts to take it from you look pathetic in hindsight. Richard had tried to erase me from my own story, but here I was, telling it louder and prouder than ever. And the entire room was listening. He hadn't just failed to take my career. He'd accidentally handed me the beginning of my greatest chapter. And as far as I was concerned, that was the kind of justice no settlement check could ever buy.